There's nothing like 8 years underwater to teach you leadership under pressure. My guest, Robert Ronska, his new book is Beyond the Sea and focuses on combating toxic workplaces with love. Welcome, Bob.
Thank you so much. Such an honor and pleasure to be here.
It's a delight to have you. You have an amazing story to tell, but let's start with a nickname and get that out of the way. President Bush named you.
He did. He did. He named a lot of people, and he fondly, that's how one of the things he led with love, he nicknamed you. And so one day we were doing some bike maintenance, and he asked his personal aide, he says, "Who helped you?" And he went down the list and he said, "Bob." And he says, "Bob who?" And he says, Navy Bob, because I was, and that stuck with me ever since.
You used to ride bikes with the president.
We did, and in the he loves to tell the story. We were at the Beijing Olympics, and so we got to test ride the actual course, and I took a fall. It was and he loved it. There was a picture of me at the end and him holding me and pointing to, the injury, and so he just loved that. And so, yes, I used to ride, at Camp David, used to ride at Beltsville, all throughout, whenever we used to travel, he used to ride bikes.
Your title was Navy aide to the president?
It was the naval aide to the president, which carried the nuclear codes primarily, but it was other duties, responsibilities such as ceremonial aid, and basically you protected the president. You were in charge of all the military assets when you were on the road, to include Air Force One, Marine One, and all the services, military services to support his safety.
And that nuclear code that you refer to, that's kind of called the nuclear football sometimes?
It is. There's a briefcase that has to be around the president at all times to ensure deterrence and so that we can respond if needed, to be able to prevent future wars.
I mean, that's an extraordinary responsibility. Was it nerve-wracking for you to be carrying that about?
It was. And so my first assignment was on in the nuclear navy was on a ballistic missile submarine, USS West Virginia. So I saw the responsibility on a ballistic missile submarine, and then to carry the nuclear codes to be able to execute that, and to know what devastation that could actually occur and be responsible for potential, facilitating Armageddon. Yes, it was a stressful job.
So you were on the Virginia, that was a nuclear-powered submarine, but also a nuclear-armed submarine?
It was. There's two types of submarines in the Navy. There's a ballistic missile submarine, which they carry the nuclear warheads, which is part of the nuclear triad. They have ICBMs and bombers and submarines. But then there's another submarine called a fast attack, and I was on both of them. And I commanded the USS Texas, which was a fast attack.
Wow, so you were 28 years in the Navy. As you say, you, commanded nuclear power fast attack submarines, including the Texas. In this book, your first lessons in leadership were really sort of what not to do. Um, you you provide some examples. Maybe you can give our listeners one of those.
Sure, there was one. My first submarine was a toxic work environment. I came home and I told my wife, I said, "Don't let me stay in the Navy one more day than I have." This is when I first started out when I was 23 years old. And then someone came in, new leader, and he showed me compassion and love. And so I stuck it out. And then I really found this secret of leading with love underneath Captain Bruce Grooms, my second commanding officer. And he taught me that you can lead with love in a professional environment. And so that was that contrast of knowing how not to act and the impact of safety and all outcomes, compared to my second tour was leading with love, and it was just a magical culture. Outcomes exceeded all expectations. He became a legendary leader, and you built a legendary culture. So yes, that contrast was so important.
So I've seen you say that you decided to write this book based on a hypothesis you had about the fact that people in your business all kind of went to the same school, they worked on the same machines, in many ways had similar experiences on the job, and yet there were really profound differences in outcomes, including some fairly high profile accidents that occurred on some submarines.
So absolutely. And so the nuclear navy, we've never had a reactor accident in over 75 years of operation. And like you mentioned, everyone goes to the same schools, everyone uses the same procedures, everyone uses the same equipment. And yet we've had accidents. And this was my hypothesis as a prospective commanding officer instructor, which was one of my assignments before I took right after command. I got to ride a lot of submarines, and I would go on these submarines and I would see such a difference. And the only thing that was different was the culture and leadership. It was a homogeneous pool of sailors, and they were all gone through the same school, but yet there was such a impact and difference in performance and outcomes. And then I went to get my doctorate at Rollins College, and I studied leadership. And so I put this hypothesis to test. And there is over 50 years of academic research that demonstrates that if you develop authentic, caring relationships, all outcomes will exceed all expectations. And that was proving my hypothesis.
And having an accident, I mean, these accidents didn't disrupt the nuclear function of the submarines. There was one, I believe that, was a collision with a Japanese fishing vessel many, many years ago that killed a bunch of people. There was an incident where a Navy vessel actually ran into kind of an underground mountain.
Yeah.
Um, but because it's a nuclear vessel, the potential for harm is so great. I mean, that's not unlike a nuclear reactor, or there is a presence of that same
Oh, oh,
function.
oh, absolutely. So these collisions, you can you can damage the nuclear reactor, and so yes, there's harm, but what the nuclear reactor, what it is that even though that culture is there in some points, there's such a rigorous inspection. They look for drift that it kind of prevents that. And I would say in some of these submarines, they've been lucky, and hope is not a plan. And so I think that the culture that the nuclear navy has instilled is so important. But what you do is you get drift up forward and you have these accidents.
Yeah. So leading with love is an interesting concept. It seems sort of anathema in some ways to the Navy or the military in general, or even just the workplace. So explain what you mean by love.
So when I started researching this book, it took me 5 years to write this. I didn't have love in my vocabulary, and so through my research, I looked back and I I found what was the best way to describe this. And so in the book, first was my aha moment. I was behind enemy lines, thousands of miles from my home port, doing a mission vital to national security in the backyard and a stone throws away from the most capable adversary submarine that is out there. And we thought we were counter detected, which means they found us. And if they knew we were there, they would have done everything they possibly could to have us surface so they can take pictures so that we would be on USA Today. And if you look at the cost of each submarine doing this to the taxpayer dollars, it was about $100 million, the $2 billion submarine. And my executive officer, it's in the book, Gary Montalvo, spoke up and preventing us from leaving. And I look back on it was a 99% chance that I thought they had us and I was ready to get out of there. And we would have lost $100 million of this national, but money was not the main concern. But why did he speak up? Why did he rep, jeopardize his reputation and his professional development? And there's no other way that I can explain it is love. He had my back at the cost of his own because if he was wrong, he would have his professional judgment would have been in question because I had his back at the cost of my own, which means I define love as sacrificially giving of oneself for the benefit of others. And the Navy SEALs, I also talk about this in the book. I was fortunate to or privileged to deploy with SEAL Delivery Team One on my third my third submarine.
And explain what a SEAL delivery team is, because not everybody knows.
So a SEAL Delivery Team One, there's SEAL teams on the East Coast and West Coast. So SEAL Team Six was the SEAL team that did the raid on Osama bin Laden. SEAL Delivery Team One is in San Diego, and they would deploy with this little James Bond submarine. They're known as SEAL Delivery Team, and they would put this little James Bond submarine on the back of a submarine as a bus to go out to some undisclosed location to let them do their mission.
And you're escorting them there
We're
essentially.
escorting them there on the submarine. So for 2 months, I really got to see the culture of SEAL Delivery Team One. And during this time when we were deploying with them, if anyone has seen the movie Lone Survivor, that same team with Michael Murphy and Marcus Luttrell, the, their team was on my submarine, majority of them. And so what happens in Lone Survivor is, if anyone hasn't seen the movie, Michael Murphy, they're behind enemy lines in Afghanistan, and they get found. They get they get found that they were there. And so the next thing they see them surrounded by incredible gunfire. And Michael Murphy, knowing that everyone was going to die, risked his life or knew he was going to die. He goes out on this ridge and makes a phone call to get in reinforcements.
Goes on a ridge, sort of like high
Yeah,
up enough
so
to.
so he can get communication. They didn't have satellite communications with the Iridium phone, and so he makes the phone call. So he saves the other people, and there's one survivor, and that's the title of the movie, Lone Survivor. So fast forward 3 years later, now I'm the naval aide to the president. I'm on stage supporting President Bush posthumously give the Medal of Honor to Michael Murphy's parents. And who's in the audience is Michael Murphy or Marcus Luttrell, the lone survivor. There wasn't a dry eye in the East Room. And the point is this: that you think about love as kind of touchy feeling. It's not. Love is sacrificially giving of oneself for the benefit of others. And if you think about, here's a guy that used to command a nuclear submarine, in charge of 10 nuclear submarines as a Commodore, carried the nuclear codes. We talked about potentially responsible for Armageddon. And then the Navy SEALs. When you think of Navy SEALs, some would not think of love, of how talented they are. But there's no other way to explain Michael Murphy and what he did. Sacrificially giving of oneself. There's no greater sacrifice than giving one's life for his fellows. So love is the only way I can explain this.
If you're just joining us, we're talking to the author and former Navy commander, Navy Bob Bronska, ahead of his author talk tomorrow at Story and Song Bookstore in Fernandina Beach. You can join our conversation by calling 904-549-2937. You can also email firstcoastconnect@wjct.org, or you can reach out on social media. We've got an email from Mark. He says, the best CO I ever worked for was Commander Lanny King. His motto was, catch them doing something right.
So I love that. And so I've spent 5 years in healthcare. In healthcare, there's a different culture that we need to change. And the culture that needs to be changed needs to be adopted in the nuclear Navy. And one of the reasons why the nuclear Navy is so safe is that we call that when you have an error, we celebrate it. Instead of finding fault with people, we celebrate it,
Hmm.
which means we celebrate that it could have been much worse. And so we get around the table, we talk about even how minor it is, we celebrate it so that we can prevent something more catastrophic to happen in the future. So what he's saying there is that you celebrate small order deficiencies before they become big ones. And Captain Grooms that I mentioned earlier used to say all the time, it's not what happens to you, it's what you do to make sure it doesn't happen again. And the nuclear Navy was, during the deep dive of the Challenger in 1986, 73 seconds after launch, they went in and did an investigation of why the Challenger exploded, one of the most national tragic events. And what they found is it was the O-ring. Everyone knows about the O-ring, but it was much deeper than that. There were so many smaller order deficiencies because they didn't celebrate them and fix them, that when it came time to the O-ring, they let it go. And what they concluded is the probability of a catastrophic event is directly proportional to the number of smaller order deficiencies. So what he was saying is building this culture where you celebrate this and you find that you want to just fix everything and not blame people for making a mistake. This is the culture that's why he became a legendary culture, because he led with love.
We've got a call from Emily in Riverside. Good morning, Emily. Go ahead.
Good morning. How are you?
Great. Thanks for joining us.
Hi, Emily.
Hi, Bob. I just wanted to comment and thank you for writing this book. My brother was a Cold War submariner on nuclear submarines. He retired as a senior Reichenbusch, and he retired at the Dolphin. He wanted to live in San Diego. But his stories reflect so much of what you're saying and what you wrote in your book, and I just wanted to thank you. He was on a team that created, they found and they re-welded a World War II era submarine rescue pod when the Russian sub sank in the Baltic. And he was ready to go, but unfortunately politics intervened and they didn't go. But his whole um, life in the Navy is reflected in what you're talking about today. So thank you.
Well, thank you, Emily. And I'm asking you a favor, and everyone that's listening, help me spread this word and make this world a better place. I leading with love. There's no doubt in my mind this world needs love more than any time. And what you experienced with your family is really special, and we need to duplicate this across America. And this book is applicable to any person at any age aspiring to be a leader or is a current leader in any industry. And this, if you're aspiring to take your leadership to the next level, to unbelievable heights, there's a roadmap and practical examples in this book. So thank you so much, Emily, for the call.
And you made a point, this is not an opportunity for you to tell, kind of quote unquote war stories. It's an opportunity for you to explain how you learned these lessons of leadership. But the stories are pretty intense. There's one in the book where you talk about being in the frigid waters in the Denmark Strait, the same place that the Titanic sank because of an iceberg, and you're trying to navigate those waters. Tell us a little bit about that incident and what happened.
So, so I'm glad you brought this up. And so where I put this to test is that I talked about my XO speaking up in that critical
And
environment.
your XO is your commanding officer,
My XO was my second in command when I was captain of this. Of
so
the
you're over
Texas.
the XO.
I am.
Okay.
He's second. I was 42 years old. He's 32. And so this is the tail end of my command tour, the USS Texas. But it wasn't always like that. And so when I first took over the Texas in 2009, we were the worst performing ship in the squadron of 10. It was playing whack-a-mole. Every day it would be a serious whack-a-mole game. I didn't know it wasn't a question of if, it was when and where we'd have another issue. And this was so much higher than any other ship that I've been on. And so I didn't go to start punishing people like you do in traditional leadership. I looked myself in the mirror and I said, what am I doing to be able to create this culture, or what barriers or what resources they don't have? So I did something simple. In the book, I talk about doing the simple thing of asking them the crew top three. What are your top three concerns? And what I found was unbelievable barriers that the crew was happening. And that's when I knew that the crew didn't care for the ship because the ship didn't care for them.
And the gear wasn't sufficient, is that right? I mean, you needed, like, additional computers.
So the different computers. So this is a $2 billion nuclear submarine. We could definitely afford computers. And half the computers were broken because of apathy. Just no one cared that things were broken. And so I got new computers. And I said to the crew right after I found out, it was like 2 weeks after I took over, I said, I am so sorry. I did not know you didn't have computers. And what this entailed is 2 hours extra per sailor per day that have to stay on board because of inefficiencies of computers that they couldn't be with their families. And so when I started addressing that, and they started to feel that the ship or organization cared for them, it was like 88 miles an hour in Back to the Future. All outcomes went up. And it was about 3 months later. And so some of the issues we were dealing with, we were going back to the Denmark Strait. When you go underneath the North Pole, the water is so cold that all the condensation in the interim comes out. And they're dropping on these highly energized cabinets.
You mean inside the ship?
Inside the ship. It was a rainforest inside the engine room.
Oh.
And they could drop on these highly energized cabinets, which have vent holes that are pointing up for better circulation. And they can go on a microprocessor to cause the reactor to no longer function. And sometimes you were operating in water that for 2 days you couldn't surface because the ice was so thick. And if you lose the reactor and you can't surface because you can't operate your emergency diesel generator for supplemental power, you die, just like the Kursk. But we're also transiting the Denmark Strait, dodging these icebergs that sink the Titanic, and there were adversary submarines getting ready to come out and find us. But my biggest concern was the culture of the crew. And that is where we changed the culture by doing something, by leading with love. We went from the worst submarine to the best submarine in about 2 years. We had the highest retention, lowest turnover for 2 consecutive years in the Pacific Fleet, and we scored the highest possible grade on one of the major engineering inspections. And it wasn't me. It wasn't my ability, tactical ability, technical ability. It was this culture of leading with love and empowering the people that I served. That was the key, and it's discussed in this book.
And you continue to do that one, two, three, what are your top concerns or complaints among the crew? And it kind of has a really funny conclusion right before you step down.
Yeah. So at the end, the stack was this thick. When the computers, I won't go through it, but it was just, I had no idea. It was too, and I interviewed everybody, and nothing came out because I didn't formally go to them and say, "What are your concerns?" Like everyone has a suggestion box. Suggestion box. I was just talking to a CEO. No one uses a suggestion box because leaders, you have to be out there in front and ask them. So I routinely did this every month, crew top three. And at the start, the stack was like this. And at the end, there was one concern after 3 years, one concern only. And I saw that on my desk and was about to leave. The concern was there wasn't sufficient variety of hot sauces on the mess deck. I knew when I got that, I said, this is magical. This is what the subjective
We need
way.
more hot
Oh
sauce.
my gosh. But one thing that for the listeners out there, doing something as simple, because if you have a survey, you're not feeding back to the people, you shouldn't be doing the survey because it's actually harming your trust. Because trust is defined as having good intentions, which you'll have with leading with love, but to follow up your words with actions. And if you don't follow up your words with actions, you're not going to gain trust.
Got a call from Harold in Atlantic Beach. Good morning, Harold. Go ahead.
Good morning. I was the last Canadian to come down and fly on an exchange posting with the U.S. Navy off the Carrier Forrestal here in Jacksonville. And in the Canadian Air Force, I'm not celebrating errors and stupid mistakes we made. It was a very open process for discussion, and there was no punitive action. Whereas when I was sitting in the wardroom, the ready room of a carrier and telling people about the dumb things I might have just done on a recent flight, all the jaws hit the ground because it was a punitive approach in the U.S. Navy at the time, and so nobody would fess up. So when you lead through fear, ultimately you may get short-term results, but you get long-term disasters.
That's a good
So-
comment, Harold. Yeah.
So Harold, I couldn't agree more. And leading with fear, you get short-term results, as you said, but you will not sustain long-lasting results that you need. You won't become a legendary leader, or you won't build a legendary culture. And going back to the Texas, there was an inflection point about 3 months after I started caring for the crew and opening up and having this psychological safety. The crew was no longer fearful of making a mistake so that they were fearful of getting in trouble. They were fearful of making a mistake because they didn't want to let anyone else down. And when you hit that critical inflection point of changing that culture, like you said, to be able to open up and make mistakes and be honest, you're going to see your culture take off in results. So Harold, I couldn't agree with you more. The punitive, what a lot of organizations today lead with fear, that will not work or sustain, and you will not become a legendary leader or have incredible outcomes.
Well, his book is called Beyond the Sea, Leading with Love from the Nuclear Navy to the White House and Healthcare. His name is Navy Bob Ronska, and he is going to speak tomorrow at 4:00 at the Story and Song Bookstore in Fernandina Beach. Bob, thanks so much for coming on the program.
Thank you so much. It's such a pleasure.